All right, guys, and welcome back to the next episode of the Grip Performance Podcast. We've sort of gone back and forth on a couple of different topics, and we've decided that the next one that we're going to hit today, seeing that it is very timely, is going to be hydration, and specifically how you can improve and optimize your hydration leading into the open, right? And now for most people, the open is essentially another training session. So many of the principles that we talk about today are going to be something that you can apply to every session that follows. It doesn't have to be these are specific protocols that you can only use for the 3 weeks of the CrossFit Open, right? We hope that we can give you some nuances that you're able to apply to your day-to-day to improve your training and also just your competitive performance. We'll visit some of the maybe more competition-specific hydration protocols as well throughout, but for the most part, let's dial in and talk about how we can sort of improve hydration leading into the opens. Just to piggyback off the episode that we had last week when we spoke about, consistency and habit building and, building rhythm and formation for, positive changes to affect our training and competition performance. Hydration and, building positive hydration routines is going to be something that's going to have a huge impact on our performance. And so let's give some insight into how we can, optimize some of our, whether it's pre-training hydration, day-to-day hydration, or even just rehydration post-session, right? For you yourself, with people that you've worked with specifically for CrossFit, what are some of the, insights that you've given them, or some of the parameters that you like people to focus on as they sort of lead into a training session or something like the open that they know is going to be different?
Yeah, well, just to expand on, to answer that question, but through the expansion of some of the points you just made, is firstly, you touched on the fact that the open is exactly what you just said. It is yes, it's a competition, but it's sort of like it's structured in the way of a extended training session in a sense, right? With a sequence. We also want to look back at what we touched on last week with consistency and build off the fact that part of hydration is consistency, right? Consistency falls into that category. And why those two things matter for this conversation is because you don't train CrossFit in the winter or the summer or the spring or the autumn. You train it consistently through the year. And the hydration needs of an individual change through that year. And they change with heat and environment, competition season, frequency of training, volume of training, all those things. And that's going back to your actual question. What am I talking to? What strategies am I using? Well, first thing we're going to do is we're going to establish the need of the person. We're going to establish where they train, how they train, even time of day in which they train. And we're going to look at managing that hydration potentially in isolation, in the case of just, for example, just fluids, or we may have to actually combine it to multiple birds with one stone. So that could be the use of things like electrolytes if the person's training or competing in a hot climate. So let's say the north of Australia, and we do know that people listening will travel or potentially even live up north as well. And compare that with, all right, if they're training first in the morning and they may be a little bit sensitive to, say, carbohydrates pre-workout, are we looking at utilizing a liquid carb bound with the electrolytes, both bound in water?
Yeah.
These are stacked options. We talked about that cascade effect last week. And that cascade effect, all right, what are the problems we have and how can we address it in the simplest form? Well, hydration can cover that in a cascade fashion. Hydration is going to look after, obviously, hydration status. The carbohydrates are going to fuel us. The electrolytes are going to help us maintain that hydration within our body or retain it. But both of those last 2 points, both carbohydrate and electrolytes, will actually help retention in a different way by slowing the gastric rate of emptying, which means how fast the fluid leaves the stomach. If we can control that gastric emptying a little bit better, we then control how fast it goes from the intestinal cavity into the blood. And the more controlled we do that, the more retained, the more the person feels and responds in a hydrated manner.
Yeah. Just to sort of visit that and break it down a little bit, what he's saying is having that combination of the carbs with the fluid is rather than you just getting up in the morning, slamming a bunch of water and then going to the gym being like, I've hydrated, you're going to just spend majority of that session just pissing, right? So like we've gone from having the right, idea with like, well, I need to be hydrated. I'm going to drink a whole lot of water and then I'm going to go walk out, and then actually having almost the opposite effect to that. So that sort of pairing with the, the electrolytes, the sodium, and or with the carbohydrates just help with the retentive nature of that. So, and personally, I think a lot of people who train early are probably leaning more towards that a liquid carbohydrate source is probably going to just be way more convenient. We sort of touched on, like not making a ton of noise in the morning if you live with people, and, it's going to be more convenient for you to just get up and have some sort of like liquid carbohydrate electrolyte drink. So I think the convenience is there, but also just the sheer, the properties that are going to help with the retentive nature of that hydration.
Yeah, I mean, like it all comes back to, so the more, well, yeah, I suppose the more technical way of saying it is what we call solute concentration. So how much solute or solid particles have been dissolved within that fluid. And the higher the concentration of solute, the slower that rate of emptying is going to actually occur. Now, there is a capacity to that. And by capacity, I don't mean as in like how much can dissolve. That would be called saturation. But what we're talking about is how much a person can tolerate. So if we want to look at it, the easiest probably way to assess this would be percentages. A person can actually tolerate during training, during actual exertion, about 8%. So that would mean for those playing at home, it would mean for every 100 mils, there would be 8 grams of carbohydrates or some type of solute. Now, it's important we extend that and say that is during exertion, and it also has to be trained. So we go through this process of gut training. So if let's say this is your first open, or you're moving into the opens, or you're moving into a higher category, for example, you expect the intensity of the session to go up. All of these things have to be considered because you may only be at 4% capacity. And then we push to 5, 6, 7, and 8. Also, if let's say you train at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. and you're an early riser, you consume your carbohydrate fluid much earlier. You can push it to 10, 11, 12, because you've given yourself adequate time to actually pass that fluid through the digestional cavity. But if you're a person who's, putting on their shirt as they run out the door, trying to get to class or get to your session, you may have to tone it down a notch because it's too close. That proximity to the session is too high.
So what you're saying is if someone's like, oh, well, I don't want to drink, 600 ml to a liter, so I'm just going to use the same amount of carbohydrates. I'm going to mix it in 400 ml, 300 ml shaker and slim it down, because that just makes heaps of sense because it's just less fluid. What you're trying to say is like, that's probably not going to end that.
No, it's not. And, if we stack that with what's more common to happen in the morning, it's both carbohydrates and we add caffeine into that. Caffeine also contributes to that solute concentration as well. And this is where it gets really funny. Caffeine's, and I'm going to use the term efficacy, but that just means time to actually come on or to hit you. It reaches a thing called peak blood volume in about sort of 60 minutes, right? And I'm going to get gross for one moment, but it creates this nervous system or neural response to the small intestines and creates these small vertebrations. And you may know this, you may have felt this. You drink caffeine within 5, 10, 15 minutes, you are running to the bathroom. So that's a combination of these vertebrations on the small intestines, which pushes everything down because everything opens up and, of course, gravity kicks in. But also, if that concentration of solute is too high, there's a thing called osmotic diarrhea where the body pushes fluid in from the bloodstream. And, of course, that creates a flush. And those things go together. And next thing you know, you're in the bathroom in minutes' time.
So if you're a GRIP member and you know that we're doing the bathroom renovations at the moment, take this into consideration, right? Because we want to keep those things schmick for a long time, right? This exact circumstance I see unfold a lot, especially at competitions, right? And it may even be something now like, we've mentioned the open, where you take this principle of I'm going to utilize liquid carbohydrates before I train, right? You sort of overestimate the amount of carbohydrates that you're required to have and, potentially even on a competition day, and you haven't adequately trained. So if you've gone from barely eating, before you train
you're
to
a fasted trainer, for example.
Right? To then implementing this at essentially, maybe even just the general recommendations of, say, like a carbohydrate electrolyte supplement, right? You're like, well, I've gone from nothing to then now I'm having 40 grams of, carbohydrates before I train. The concept of gut training, which, Phil just visited, what we're saying is you're better off to be slightly more conservative initially and work your way up, right? So you're building the tolerance to that over time, because by being more tolerant, by building up, you're removing the worst variables of things, right? And you're not going to have, like, maybe you could have tolerated a little bit more, but you are better off being slightly more conservative just in that initial phase to sort of see how well you tolerate these types of carbohydrates.
Yeah, generally there's a safety threshold, I suppose you would say, where if a person is historically a fasted trainer, or a person who maybe just has like a couple of, jelly beans or the case may be, 25 grams of carbohydrates tends to be a great place to start for most people. Okay, that also pairs well with the duration of CrossFit sessions too. You
Mhm.
don't need to pump 60 grams of carbs, 70 grams of carbs for CrossFit, because if we're talking about a class situation, there's a lift or a couple of lifts at the start, then there's a WOD. The WOD's going to be somewhere in between, at most 25 minutes for most classes. So the idea that you need to pound 60 grams of carbs in before a workout is just not realistic. So we start at 20 to 25 grams, maybe 20 grams for a smaller female, 25 grams for a male. And then we can push, and we'd really stop. For most people, we'd stop about 40 to 45 grams at most.
And as far as a fluid amount with that, what would you consider to be an adequate or an appropriate fluid volume pairing with that?
Provided there's nothing else added to that fluid. So providing there isn't a caffeine source or an electrolyte source, we're just pure carbohydrates. We can easily do the math at about 5%. So I would look at somewhere between sort of 700 and a liter. Okay. One of the biggest considerations we must talk about when it comes to first thing in the morning hydration principles is you have just come from hopefully 8 hours of sleep and your body has lost fluid through the night. You may wake up feeling fresh and your bed sheets are dry, but part of our thermoregulation response is actually excreting fluid to maintain that heat response in our system. So you've lost the fluid into your bed sheets through the night. So you have to replace that bedwetters. Okay, sure. A bit of incontinence here and there. But we have to replace that fluid. So we are, even for a small person, we're talking at least 600, 650. This is mils, obviously. But I would say 700 to 750 is a start. And then for the larger males, anywhere up to 1.2 liters, provided there's adequate time prior to the session. You don't want to be drinking that while you're driving to the club.
And what do you think, like, for the average person just doing a CrossFit class, right? Because now there's a little bit of a nuance between obviously an elite CrossFit athlete. His session's going to look quite different. And we're at the moment very much talking to say most listeners of this podcast who are completing, CrossFit, general functional fitness classes. What would that look like for that person, right? I know you mentioned that it doesn't have the addition of electrolytes, but would that something appropriate be Staminade powder, Powerade powder? Would we be talking, dextrose and water, or like what's sort of the combination that you would say is convenient, easy to access,
this is for
class goers? People? Let's say class goers, and then you could, I'm sure that's still appropriate for an elite athlete, but they're probably just going to be fueling, again at some later point within the session, right?
Sure. From a commercially available position, I'm a huge fan of Staminade. A lot of people sort of tend to lean very heavily into things like Powerade or Gatorade, particularly the powders. I try and, unless it's a grab and go necessity, I'll try and turn most of my clients away from the pre-packaged or ready to drink options, and I'll turn them towards the powder.
Cheaper too, right? The powders.
Substantially cheaper. But also Staminade, there's a couple of categories, and sorry to divert, but I'll come back, is look at availability. So all the powders we're talking about, Powerade, Gatorade, and also Staminade, are available from supermarkets. So that adds a level of convenience and a level of accessibility. Now we look at the actual quality of the products. Powerade in particular is just sodium. Okay. Now, yes, sodium is the most important of the electrolytes. Gatorade has a little bit of potassium, but it's next to nothing. Staminade, however, has potassium, sodium, magnesium, calcium, and chloride in it. Okay. It's 14.6 grams of carbohydrates per 16 gram serve. It's lemon lime, which means the palatability isn't overpowering. When it comes to Gatorades and particularly Powerades, they tend to be quite heavily flavored. Now, palatability or flavor profiling of a product is a forgotten rule when it comes to consumption, because if the athlete or the person doesn't like it, they're less likely to adhere to it, right? And this goes for nutrition in a wider spectrum as well. Now, why does that matter? It matters more at 5 a.m. because you've just woken up. You're not going to go and make a syrup-filled cordial at that time and smack it, right? So the same rule applies with the hydration principles. Staminade's much easier to drink. It's lighter on the flavor. It contains all 4 and I'll say 4.5 electrolytes, because chloride is charged, but it's not technically an electrolyte. And then it contains a controllable amount of carbohydrates. So 14.6 per 16 grams. So.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And like, this is the other thing about flavor, obviously, is we're taking into consideration these are supermarket orientated products, right?
100%.
So like, that's almost equally as much of a consideration as is, the formulation. But, they're well aware that the consumerism side of it is going to prioritize flavor. So, that's a huge.
As we move up that channel from like let's say class goers into sort of class goers, but still have a performance orientation. So I categorize those people as what I call athletically minded people.
Yeah. They're the people that are probably going to do the open, right?
100%. They're the ones that, like, everyone
Yeah.
will do it, but they'll register for it,
100%.
right? So with those individuals, I'd want to hope they were a bit more organized.
Yeah.
If they weren't, and even if they were, and they said, hey, listen, I really enjoy Staminade for the reasons we've just stated, tick boxes. If they are a bit more organized and they've got Oz Post working on their behalf, TrainAid Performance is very good.
Yeah.
So TrainAid Performance is very good. True do a really good product too.
Yeah, True's electrolyte's a good one.
Yeah. And if you're doing a lot of stuff, so obviously we're speaking now to the wider audience, which both does the open, but then also does a bit of hybrid or concurrent training in the big wide world as well. We can look at things like Infinite and things like that as well. But
I guess just to touch on that too, actually, I like recommending things, even though we're not associated with any brand, but like what makes you say, and obviously we understand, but like what makes you say that TrainAid and say the True electrolytes are applicable to these people, right?
Sure.
Because there is, as we are well aware, electrolyte products are like, there is a ton of them at the moment. Like if you scroll Instagram for more than 10 seconds, like you're going to get 3 different electrolyte products as advertisements, right? So what makes you say these are the sorts of products that are going to be most applicable to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that I think doesn't get covered enough. When I talk about electrolytes with people, I personally categorize them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll categorize them as to their suitability or where they should be placed in a person's session, either around their session through the day or maybe post-session.
Yeah.
And I call them recovery electrolytes, preload electrolytes, or potentially intra-electrolytes.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if we talk about the products we've just spoken about, TrainAid is a continuous consumption product. It's a very low grade, but very high. The ratio is perfect between sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. The ratio is exactly what the body needs for the absorption factor, but it's not overloading the person with sodium. So a lot of these products now, it's like, a bit like the old caffeine wars where if some is good, more must be better.
Right.
You've got these products coming out now with 1,000 milligrams.
I'm so glad we're touching on this, right? Because for most people that read a nutrition panel, they're going to look at it and go, well, this one has 1,000 milligrams of sodium. It's about the same price.
Yes.
So shouldn't I just get that one and have that right before I train or in the middle of my session? But sorry to cut you off, but I know we're
No, it's a valuable thought process. And like if we look at TrainAid, for example, and even for that matter, Staminade, we're talking about 45 to 55 milligrams of sodium because they're designed to be done through the session. If we take in too much sodium, we create this thing called hypovolemia, which is just, it's too much sodium in the system, right? Hypovolemia is a change in the blood viscosity, and it changes the way our vascular system actually works. Too much information. The point is we need to control the fluid response, but again, going back to palatability, absorption rates, things like that. Then we move into what I call the recovery electrolytes. So recovery electrolytes, for example, is products like Boost Sport, potentially the FitAid product. I'm actually currently using that at the moment. 500 milligrams of sodium. So because I don't drink electrolytes through my session, I want to restore them in the aftermath.
And we used Hydrolyte Sport at Down Under. We had Hydrolyte, and this is the thing, we had a couple of different brands, right? So with the crew that we were staying with, so we had the Hydrolyte Sport, and I think there was also, I don't even remember what the brand was. It was a Chemist Warehouse brand, essentially equivalent to the dosages of alongside TrainAid. I think it was. Yeah. It's one of the big American ones.
Hydrolyte Sport is 350, I believe it is. It's a 350 milligram.
There's Hydrolyte Sport that comes in the Boost tabs, or the tablet style one.
There's a tub one.
A tub one. And I remember the tub one because we had this conversation and it was slightly more than what I think you thought off the top of your head because it had changed recently.
That conversation. Yeah. I generally don't, unless an athlete is sport, has to be sport friendly. So for example, like Informed Choice has to, or Informed Sport, I generally don't necessarily use Hydrolyte a lot. Mm-hmm. And that's just it's not anything because I'm against Hydrolyte. It's just I have other brands that I still push towards.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But yeah, Hydrolyte, the one that you guys used, I think it was because I thought it was 250, but it was 350 or something like 380 maybe.
It was around 400.
So that category, so the Hydrolyte Sport and the True products are very good prior to session. because you can put them in a larger lot of water. Your goal is to retain as much fluid as you can going into the session to obviously help with perspiration, things like that. And then again, going back to the post-workout stuff, we have, the Voos Sport. And I do mean Voos Sport, not the Voos product.
Yep.
Again, accessibility, it's available at Coles, Woolworths, and Chemist Warehouse. I really like that aspect. If we've got an athlete who's traveling around Australia and they do miss something or forget something, I can send them to any Coles, any Woolworths, any Chemist Warehouse and grab the product, which I really like. And that's part of the coaching aspect, is finding usable products which are on hand. And then we can go from there into the really extreme things. So not so much here in Australia, but I work with like things like Trioral, for example. In the US, Trioral is 1,000 milligrams, but that's only to specific people. For example, I'm working with a high-level jiu-jitsu guy at the moment. He sweats like an animal, but he's training 4.5 hours a day. That's a big factor to consider. So we use Triol with him, but even with him, I use half sachets at a time.
Splitting it up.
And then with my professional guys, just due to various sponsorships, Precision Nutrition, Precision Hydration and Nutrition, they have a 500, 1,000 and a 1,500, which again is insanity.
You have to be very, very, very salty. So you'd be on the upper echelon to be, and you're using it as your recovery. But like, once again, just to touch on the dosages, just to look at the sheer sodium content of something and to assume that more is better is false. You're looking at these products as categories of electrolytes. And now many of the brands aren't going to state that. They're going to leverage the fact that they have the highest sodium content because, they're going to use that for marketing purposes. But hopefully the bit of insight that we're providing here is that the more, I guess, aggressive in dosing of sodium that an electrolyte has, the more that it falls into that sort of replenishment post-workout or preloading, type electrolyte, and something that you're probably going to want to consume either in a lower dose or look for something that's ratioed a little bit better.
It's also important too, you look at, part of this is talking about, I mentioned it very briefly earlier, which I'm sure we'll go into, is things like sweat rate, for example, right? The environment you're in, even the choice of sport or the workout in which you're partaking in, that matters because that will dictate how you use the electrolyte. And for that matter, which electrolyte you're using. If you're training in Hobart, in Tasmania in July, well, probably realistically, no electrolytes are going to be suitable, or at very most, something like Train Aid, 45 milligrams of sodium. If you're in Darwin in January, guess what? Fit Aid all day, because it really does consider the environment, the person, their body mass, their muscle mass, all of these things. But on a wider spectrum of that, it's also, what does the diet look like? If a person like, Shay, for example, is my missus. She's from a Sicilian background. She salts food like there's nobody's business.
Carries it around and like on a keychain.
It drives me wild. But in saying that consideration as part of this conversation is, does she need electrolyte? Absolutely not.
No.
She doesn't need one because I can visually see how much salt she uses. Similarly, if you're a person who tends to lean more heavily on packaged items within your diet, processed meats, microwave rices that are flavored, for example, the Ben's range of rices, you may not necessarily fall into the category that requires an electrolyte, or at the very least, you may have to look at potassium-rich foods as opposed to sodium-rich foods because your sodium's probably already sky high.
Yeah, and these variables, right? So you've mentioned temperature, you've mentioned sweat rate, you've mentioned even just how, I guess, the ratio of fluid to sodium that someone uses, which you've touched on before, that has, like, there's obviously some genetic components to it, but is also quite representative of just what the person's diet is, right?
Yeah, sure.
So if they're a super salty sweater, they probably consume more salt. It's not the fact that they're just like dropping salt exponentially higher than the person next to them. It's probably, maybe there is some genetic factors to it, but it's probably also that they consume more salt. Therefore, at the same amount of fluid that's lost, there's just a higher ratio of salt.
Asker Jenkins, the godfather of sports nutrition, he talks about it quite frequently, in the sense that he suggests that those who actually have a higher salt diet will actually perspire at a higher salt consistency. So they'll actually have more salt in their sweat because their body is constantly trying to auto-regulate.
Yes.
So they will more likely have. So if you're a person who tends to lean very heavily into the salt seasonings or the processed foods we just discussed, it's probably more likely you'll have a higher salt content within your sweat.
And so with these, these sort of variables, I guess, in mind, for someone who, I'm a super sweaty person, like I'm someone who I just finished the workout and I'm just like there's puddles around me.
Sure.
How are you recommending for someone like that? Like, once again, let's just say coming into the open, right? They finish it. They're the kind of person that's like, oh, I normally set up in the corner somewhere so my sweat doesn't flick around on everyone that I'm training around. What sort of things are you wanting that person to take into consideration to ensure that they're going to finish that session, be able to rehydrate adequately, and then perform again the next day? If they're, maybe they're going to repeat that workout. Maybe they're one of those crazy people who hit it and then they're like, I'm going to hit it again in the afternoon, right? What are you saying to that person to be like, here are some principles to follow to make sure that when you come back again this afternoon, that hydration isn't one of the reasons that you perform poorly. It's just your fitness.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I'd want to see the sweat rate, and the sweat rate before I go on to answer the question in full, the sweat rate is going to change through the year. So we'll do a periodical sweat rate check because, let's say, for example, a seasonal check, autumn check, spring check, summer check, winter check. And then that will give us an indication or an approximate figure. We could do one every day, but that would be ludicrous. What we can do instead is do a seasonal sweat rate check. And then from there, in the aftermath, we'd look at some sort of type of recovery-based intake, and that's going to be at least 1.5 times what they lost. So if they're coming into a session at, let's say, really round figures here, 80 kilos, they finish the session at 78.8 kilos. That means they've lost 1.2. So that person is at least drinking 2 liters to compensate for that loss. Now, because we want the retention to obviously amplify, given the fact that they're interested in doing something later in the afternoon, we're going to have an electrolyte in there.
Yep.
In that instance, from that session, with that high of a sweat rate, we're looking at 250 milligrams of sodium, somewhere from that up to about 500. For the person who's going to not do the afternoon session, if they only lost 1.2 liters of fluid, I'd probably realistically say, all right, I want you to hit 2 liters of fluid. I would halve that and do the first liter within the first 70 minutes. And then the other liter would be across the next 3 hours. And I would simply use the salt in the food they consume and ask them to salt their food. And that would be suitable and adequate to actually restore said hydration.
That's right. And like, even just then, right, we're comparing, which we were, I don't know, maybe we'll touch on this a little bit, but comparing like the 1 session training session to a 2 session training session. And now imagine a competition day, right? And so people listening to this might be like, 1.2 kilos, like that's heaps, right? Yeah. We, prior to Down Under, and we were fortunate enough, obviously, that being on the East Coast and, Down Under's also on the East Coast, that the variables between the environment of these competitions, aren't too different, so that we were able to have a somewhat accurate representation of when we tested our sweat rate. And we actually did it with the first workout they had, which was the beach run, echo bike, so on and so forth. We took scales down and we had people weigh themselves. And this was as much of not like a scare tactic, but I wanted to educate the crew that I work with on the reality of how important hydration is. And that like most people are sort of, taking the piss a little bit with how seriously they actually take rehydrating after these sessions and, probably toss up some of their performances, whether it's on a competition day or a training day, to I didn't sleep well enough or I'm not fit enough, right? Whereas it could very well and truly be the fact that they just haven't hydrated adequately. And so we did this sweat rate test because then, little plug, have a rehydration calculator on our website that I put heaps of time into, so make sure you go and check it out. But that hydration calculator that's on there was built from a spreadsheet that I sent out to the crew that they used over that competition weekend, right? And so especially after that first workout, we're in Wollongong, we're on the East Coast, it's hot, it's super sweaty, it's super long, they're in the sun. Most of these people are not wearing shirts, or if they are, it's, the sweat rate, is exacerbated by the environment in which they're doing this in.
Also, as well, like the CrossFit, the CrossFit sort of a habit of not wearing a shirt accelerates the body's cooling effect as well. So it actually changes the way evaporation processes work versus, say, like a cotton shirt, for example.
For sure.
That's going to also influence the loss of fluid.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, so the, variables of the inside to outside, but like to continue on with that, this allowed them to have a sense of control over their ability to rehydrate, right? Because they knew like, well, this was sort of what I lost on average. We did have scales with us, and the people who were very like sort of on the ball did, weigh themselves before and after, like a few of the events. Other people sort of just use their average and the calculator, right? But that just goes to show like different personality types, and sort of, some people are very sweaty, so they're like making sure that they are very much on top of it. Other people sort of just utilize the rule of thumb as they ticked along. But it meant that they weren't going in blind. It meant that they had some reference point to be like, I understand on average how much that I'm losing in, this type of event.
Yeah.
And, that was obviously, varied between the indoor and outdoor events, the events where they kept shirts on if they were using odd objects and stuff like that, versus when they're just like popping the top and then going for it. But, for you, if you're sort of listening to this and you don't really know where to start, check out the rehydration calculator on the website, do the sweat rate test that we have, like Wayne. They're variables for understanding like how urine affects this test and some of the other variables surrounding the test. All the information can be found on there. So just check it out. We don't have to go through the walkthrough of how to do a sweat test appropriately, but
I'm sure some of those numbers that people got on those days probably shocked them a little bit too.
100%.
Yeah. I mean, and those who attended the Down Under seminar weekend that you guys did, and obviously I came and spoke. And one of the things that I always do when I do these live talks on hydration is this conversation, like get your calculators out or get your phones out, and we calculate the baseline fluid intake of an individual person based on their body weight. And you always hear some sort of noise or sort of raised eyebrows or something like that, because it just shows that people have this belief, and particularly around, you mentioned urine, people talk about clear or lightly straw colored. Well, if you are a habitual, what I call a guzzler, a person who just smashes fluid in large quantities, but infrequently through the day, my urine is always clear because I'm a guzzler. Now, am I hydrated? Probably not, because my body is just flushing the fluid straight away. Right? Whereas if you drink more habitually, more consistently through the day, that's a better indication. But going back to people who guzzle or people who drink in reactivity, they might find their urine is clear as a flush mechanism. Therefore, they perceive themselves to be hydrated. Same thing with sweat rate, right? If you're a person who sweats a certain amount, you then guzzle the fluid post-training. Again, we've discussed, you're going to flush that in a large degree. In fact, up to 45 to 55%. Yep. You're going to lose that. You then go to the bathroom because, of course, the urgency's kicked in too fast. Therefore, the retention's been, next to nothing. And again, you see your urine is clear. But what's actually happening is you're secreting or excreting all of the fluid that's coming in from that rehydration, which is the reason we drink a baseline of 150% over what we actually lose, because we have to create that buffer of loss, of expected loss. In fact, it's actually, for a very high intensity session, it's somewhere between 150 and 200% of loss.
And arguably it just feels better too, right? Like the sloshing and the bloatedness that comes from just slamming down that much water at once. Like I know you said you do it, and like I know a lot of people that I work with that are very much like that I've been alongside comps where I feel like I'm the mother taking like a bottle off a kid, and I'm like, yeah, go on, ease up,
And that's why we give it times. Like I say, listen, half in the sort of 50 to 70 minutes, depending on what the time frame. Like if it hasn't been aggressive rehydration principle, I'll give a shorter time frame. But for most people, it's sort of 50 to 70 minutes for the half of that fluid. Yep. And then the second half can be done over the couple of hours following that first hour. Because like you said, we don't want that sloshy, we don't want that reactivity in the gut or that feeling sensation in the gut.
For sure. So that covers a lot in regards to what we're kind of doing before and after, right? What about now when we think of just, you mentioned before, I'm giving someone a day-to-day. What does that day-to-day number sort of look like?
Yeah. So there's lots of equations, right? But if you do the equations across the board, they'll generally be within about 300 to 500 mils across all of them, whether you use Andy Galpin's method, the method I use, the poundage method, whatever it is. But the calculation that I tend to lean very heavily on is your body weight in kilos times 0.04. Okay, that's the easiest method. If you use the 30-pound method or the times 22 method, you'll find that whatever number that I've given you via my equation or the equation I use, it'll be within 300 mil of that. Okay, so just to say it again, it's your body weight in kilos times 0.04. Now, if you're a person who tends to be very highly active, and by active, I don't necessarily mean in exercise. I mean, if you're have a physical job or you're a person who just is on their feet all day, you might want to look more heavily towards your body weight in kilos times 0.045. That might be more indicative of your personal needs. And then obviously we tack on exercise to that as well via the way of fluid loss, etc. But let's say you're a carpenter, a bricklayer, even a nurse, for example, leaning towards that 0.045 is probably a safer bound.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I agree. So I use the exact same one. As it comes to, the day-to-day, I guess, hydration protocols for people too, is there anything that whether you implement it in, I guess, your day-to-day or you've recommended it to, clients that you work with for ensuring that they're able to hit that number consistently and hit that number, when it matters too, right? Like the fact that they're not going to go train early in the morning and then try and backlog like, oh, I'm going to hit my target, but they're hitting it from lunchtime onwards, right?
Yeah. So there actually is, and there's a few different versions. If we look at like, the work focus method, we call it the Pomodoro method, right? Where you work for a period, then you rest for a period. Yeah. Well, you can do the same thing with fluid. You can set little timers to say, all right, by this time I must consume X, by this time I must consume Y. And I try and this is, and I'm not necessarily speaking about morning trainers, but just people through the day in general. I'll try and get, for most people, sort of at least 40%, if not 50, done by midday. Okay. Now that sounds very heavy on, and it's because we want to sort of take into account things like sleep function, sleep practices, hygiene, etc. So
not getting up all night to pee.
Right. That's right. We have to understand that in nutrition science, a lot of the times, I call it looking at a masterpiece through a toilet roll. Whatever the category or the topic we're trying to discuss, we tend to only focus on the positives, the negatives, or the neutrals from that one category. And we don't consider the other implicators or factors or, contraindications that actually can impact that. The best example, and this is not a hydration conversation, but the best example is actually like carbs before bed, right? Or protein before bed. If your intention is muscle building, protein before bed is A-okay. In fact, it's actually promoted. But if you want to have a better onset of sleep, high protein before you go to bed impedes SOL or sleep onset latency, right? Which is the time in which it takes you to fall asleep from hitting the bed. Okay.
So what's the mechanism behind that? Just like the thermic effect?
The insulin response and tryptophan blockage, right? But having a small piece of fruit before you go to sleep actually creates the insulinic response, right? Which allows tryptophan to travel into the brain, therefore creates serotonin, melatonin, etc. So it's like, don't go, protein before bed is number one. Well, it is for that person's intention around hypertrophy, but it may not be for a person who's struggling with sleep. Yeah. So don't look at the masterpiece through the toilet roll. Instead, step back and go, what's the best option we have, which is not going to impede on this other thing?
Yeah. This is that big rocks conversation, right? Small rocks.
If we have this conversation back to hydration and we get 40 to 50% in before midday, or at least just before halfway of that person's day, we can then account for the other 50% in the 60% of the day that's left over. Okay? And that's going to allow that person to start to taper off.
Yeah, no, that's phenomenal, right? Like being able to set some goals throughout the day, whether it's a timer, whether, it's the hilariously marked drink bottles that do work for some people. I remember that fad being a thing for ages. It was like every time you go to a Kmart or a Coles or something like that, it was like the bottles like 1 p.m., 2 p.m., 3. I feel like they've fallen off a little bit now. Yetis at the go.
So one of my clients, and one of my clients is a mini influencer, and she has a $200 bottle that sets alarms. She can set
to her phone.
Don't know the answer to that, but it's a digital bottle, and it registers has a weight plate in it, and how much goes down, and then at certain times it dings her.
Yeah, that's hilarious. I actually think I have seen this as far. Look, if you're listening and you're struggling, there is answers. Sometimes they just cost more money.
Look, credit's due. It's helped her. She's absolutely drinking more water and more consistently. But when she told me the price, I was like, what?
Yeah.
But then Yetis costs equal amount, and they don't do any of those things.
That's a phenomenal point too.
Yeah.
Right. So as far as it goes for intra-session hydration now, right? So what are the sort of recommendations that you would give to someone throughout their training session, right? Dependent on that training session, right? So let's just say we have someone who, general like CrossFit class goer is, how are they, are you getting them to prioritize their fluid intake sort of around the training session, or are you having them, still take priority in what they're consuming throughout the session as well? And what does that look like?
It would depend on the activity itself. I mean, some activities just don't allow for hydration. But if I had to give you a golden rule, this is where I do apply the Galpin method. The Galpin method is 15 mils per kilo of body weight. That's a really good indicator. If you want to go to a more time-based function, it's 0.15 times kilos body weight per 20 minutes. I'm speaking a lot of maths here, guys, but understand that the reason why I use the maths is because a lot of this stuff is recommended around body weight. So a 50 kilo female versus a 110 kilo male is going to be wildly different. So there is that factor.
So it's not just that flat number of...
No, it's not just one can of monster. No, it's all body weight marked. And that's why we have to talk in these sort of like, algorithmic codes. Yeah, 15 mils per kilo body weight across a given hour, or 0.015 per kilo across every 20 minutes.
Yeah. And if I could give one recommendation with that as well, I know it's quite common from people that I've worked with in the past that because the concept of drinking water and being hydrated and training sort of go hand in hand, that it's easier for people to be like, well, I'm at the gym, I've got my bottle. And then they're essentially playing like catch up, or they're way more conscious of it while they're training because, oh, I'm exercising and I'm going to keep drinking fluid, right? And that sort of comes back to that conversation to be, if you are just going about your day normally, not hydrating consistently across the day, then you get to the gym, you've just filled up your water bottle on the way home, or you've gone to the water fountain in the corner and you filled it up, and in the brief you're drinking water, and then you go to the toilet, and then you sort of start maybe some of your strength training, you're drinking more water and you're back to the toilet. That this could actually be having a once again more of an adverse effect on your ability to perform than a positive effect. So making sure that you're looking at hydration as a holistic practice to the day-to-day, and how being able to split that up will have the best benefit versus being like, well, I'm at the gym, so I'm just going to make sure I'm drinking.
Also, on top of that too, just to expand on that, it's not just an adverse effect via the mechanistic urination that comes with gulping water. It's also understanding that hydration isn't restored in moments. Hydration, particularly for females, can be a little bit slower. Yeah. So we're talking somewhere between 24 and 36 hours. In fact, 24 is what we generally work off, which is why I mentioned before about salt. If you're only training once a day, we can rely on natural hydration or natural rehydration to really compensate for that. But when it's within 12 hours or within 18 hours, we have to go more aggressive, because we also understand that you drinking, a large bottle of water as you drive to the gym in the afternoon because your water intake's been garbage all day, you're still going to feel as lethargic in that session, but you'll also have to pee.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's like, it's adverse mechanistically, but then you still feel like rubbish. Yeah. So, as Tyson just said, really controlling the hydration on a consistent manner, as we talked about last week, having a method in place through the day, whether it be the Pomodoro effect, time, fluid by certain time, or a structure of the day's intake, or utilizing a fixed measurement. So those of you who've worked with me before use movie cups. I collect movie cups. And the reason why I do is because every movie cup is 750 mils. So I use a standardized intake. I've got Star Wars cups because every cup is the same. And I know that I can add those together to hit my number. Now, I'm a bigger person, for those who haven't seen me before, 134 kilos. I drink roughly 7 to 7.5 liters of water a day.
That's why I look small on the camera.
So I take that into account, right? So having a fixed intake or a fixed container of use allows me to keep that track. Tyson, what's that bottle? 1.3?
It is 1.3.
And my bottle was 40 ounces that I train with, or it's 1.2. So I have this mental math in my head of knowing exactly what I'm taking in.
Yeah, no, fair. I guess now I want to touch on let's touch on some of the competition side of things, right? We've touched on, I guess, what it could look like day-to-day training, because obviously we referenced the Open. Now, the Open is a competition in a sense, but it's not a competition in the sense that most CrossFitters are used to what competition is like with these carnival days, these multi-event days. And now hydration considerations for a competition day are going to look vastly different to what hydration considerations look like for the day-to-day. And not different as in like everything's changed, but everything's just, one, it's exaggerated a little bit more, but two, it's also the nuances and the intricacies of the timing can also play more of effect, right? If we're just constantly trying to look at, like you said, rehydrating it at like 150% all the time, like the sloshing and, how that person feels mentally going into a workout, even though they've just, sweated out a whole bunch. If there's a workout that's very close, and they're just like trying to drink the whole time and then go into that next workout, that can also negatively impact performance. I think fortunately with some of the higher level competitions, there actually is more of a break in between. So that actually helps. It's almost like the higher level that you go, the better control you have over things. But some of these local comps people go to, and it's like they do a workout and then it's like an hour later, they're like, all right, next workout. And that's an hour, including like dragging yourself off the floor, making your way back to your tent.
Having some type of meal. You actually took the words out of my mouth. I was genuinely blown away by the time between events at Down Under. We're talking 2.5, 3 hours in some cases.
Big breaks.
Big breaks. Whereas more regional, local comps, as you just said, I mean, the closest I've seen ever with one of my clients was 18 minutes, which was essentially the time it took for them to reset the barbells. and then go again. But the longest I've seen at a local comp was about 2 hours, which is quite crazy.
And I know for like the Stampede, we try and keep everything, like we try and do an hour to an hour and a half and then have a bigger break in the middle. So you sort of have like 2 events that are maybe closer and then a bigger break and then 2 events that are sort of closer.
Yeah.
And like it all changes. Like the bigger comps obviously have bigger breaks because there's more people.
Sure,
right?
of course,
and then sometimes like the local ones, they go faster because there's just less people.
Also, the arenas are more, I don't want to use the term fancier, but they essentially are fancier.
Yeah, the logistics of the running the actual
100%,
competition, just there's more things going on. They just give themselves more buffers to sort of make sure things can run smoothly. And, and like sometimes that works out, I think from a nutritional perspective, more positive for the athlete. Because I think if you are someone who has the guidance of a good coach and you're able to plan your day, like it just gives you a little bit more leeway, right? Whereas sometimes when things are just so close together that, yes, like you can still structure this to have more, like to have a good outcome. But having those longer breaks mean that like you're just removing the chance that something's going to go wrong.
You also end up spending the day, smacking down baby food sachets and rice crackers.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, your palate at the end of the day is like, I need real food.
But from a hydration point of view, there's a couple of things to consider. Firstly, CrossFit is unique it's not unique in its start time, but it's unique in its style of performance with such an early start time.
Yeah.
So you often have comps starting at 7 or 7:30 in the morning. Yeah. And the argument could be, well, triathlons start at 5 in the morning. Yeah. Look, no one's denying that, but they're a consistent or a continuous effort. CrossFit is high intensity, then rest, high intensity, then rest. And how does that mess with your hydration? Well, first off, the early morning start, as we've stated earlier in today's conversation, you're coming off a period of fasting, and that fasting is both food-related fasting and also hydration-related fasting. So creating a window where you've got plenty of time to have a solid meal, albeit easy digesting, then has some sort of combination of fluid attached to it. Now, you could use a semi-liquid meal, which is going to contribute to hydration, or you could pair hydration with it.
Semi-liquid, you mean purees?
Purees, it could also be things that have a small amount of milk in them, for example. Yep. And by the way, I'll caveat to that, milk is actually a phenomenal rehydrator. However, you must give it adequate time prior to the event commencement to actually allow it to pass, right? And similarly in the aftermath, we all know the Anchorman quote, milk was a bad choice. Well, milk is an excellent choice, provided you aren't coming off a sympathetic high drive and then you try and smash a gallon of milk. But having adequate time prior to the event, allowing that meal to go in, making that meal relatively easy to digest. And why does that matter for hydration? Because of course that food adds the solute concentration to the gut, adds particle numbers to the gut, and therefore will impact how much or how quickly that fluid leaves the gut and therefore travels from the intestines into the bloodstream.
So what you're saying is basically we touched on before where we were talking about the solution, that was the electrolytes, the carbohydrates and the fluid.
Yeah.
You're talking about the exact same concept, but it's consuming the food.
So what are the three main reasons we chew food? The 3 main reasons we chew food, and not many people actually realize this, but the first one is going to be reducing particle size. So reducing the size of the food to be smaller particles. The second is by reducing the particle size, we increase the surface area of each of those particles so that the digestive enzymes can actually attach themselves to said particles. The third reason is enzymatic control or emulsification, right? So where the chewing aspect, the mechanical action of chewing actually combines saliva with said food, creating a particularly amylase, which is obviously what breaks down glucose, coats the smaller particles and therefore begins the digestive process in the mouth. That's what chewing's done for. Well, those small particles then travel down into the gut, and that's where protein digestion kicks in. Well, that's a slow process. If you add fluid to that, all of those particles impair how fast or inhibit how fast that fluid's going to leave the gut or the stomach, I should be more accurate. That's called gastric emptying. Then it goes into the intestines and has to go from the intestines into the blood. If you've got, LSA and all of these heavy seeds and nuts and oats and things like that in your gut, well, that's slow. Yep. Yeah. I've got a recipe I use with my clients. I'm happy to pass this out to you, Tice, if you want to send it out to everyone listening, called a fancy bagel. Yeah. And it's a bagel. It's got a small amount of protein attached to it. And I use like a protein mousse made up with like for a low fat yogurt with some protein powder. Now, of course, why am I using low fat yogurt? Because fat's going to contribute to that delay as well. And then depending on how on their energetic needs, I got a guy in the US at the moment who's using it with craisins. If you know what craisins are, they're dried crainberries.
I'm assuming it's a raisin of some sort.
But over here in Australia, I use sultanas.
Yeah.
I might put a bit of honey on there too. If they need a longer drain of energy, I might put a small amount of peanut butter on there, but depending on the person's need, or a bit of Biscoff because it's just sugar. Yeah. And those things are all, if you go through the categories of the foods I just mentioned, they're all relatively quick digesting, not rapid, but relatively quick. That's going to allow us to then take in that fluid, allow that fluid to pass into the bloodstream and restore that hydration. I would also salt that meal too, and that's going to contribute to the hydration retention in the bloodstream. Now, that's obviously a big conversation in the pre-first event.
Yes, right.
Now we're looking at, if I stick with more regional and local stuff at the moment, we want to look for a lower sodium concentration based electrolyte like the Train Aids, or for example, a portion of the sachets of the Fit Aids, or a portion of a VU Sport tab, or half of it, for example.
Reduce the size.
Yep. And then dilute the water more than don't ever use the recommended dosages, which they use on the packets. They're way too strong.
Yeah.
Even half of it or double. Yeah. So looking at snapping a VU Sport, putting that in 750 to a liter.
So you're saying half of the serve or double the fluid?
That's right. Yeah. Sorry, I should have clarified that. That's a good point. Half the serve or double the fluid. And then sip on that through the day. Okay. And while there are some times in the post-workout period where aggressive rehydration is applied, after the aggressive rehydration principles are applied, which would have to be sort of generalized there because it's going to change on the session and the environment, I would then create an environment where I call it's ad libitum consumption, just meaning as the athlete wishes. But I still do a hybrid version, which is a combination of aggressive rehydration and also ad libitum consumption as well.
And that's honestly probably one of the ways that I found best as well, just over Down Under weekend, was sometimes you can almost fixate on it too much, right? Like you get these numbers and you're like, God, you're so stressed about, well, I need to make sure I'm drinking this much after the session and then this much, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, where it's like sometimes we just have a base number that we're ensuring that we're meeting for rehydration needs. And then the rest of it is, ad libitum, like as you see fit, to thirst, etc. Right. And like that, that baseline recommendation can sometimes just cover our bases where the person may just be that cooked after a workout, the last thing they're thinking about is rehydrating, right? So by giving if we're just making them like make the choice of when to rehydrate the whole time, just ad libitum as you see fit, there's a lot more margin for error in comparison to what you just mentioned, which is that combination of baseline and then ad libitum.
Yeah, and what we might do, you can actually do a 3-phase hybrid or a 3-phase combination session where you do it. And when I say aggressive, by the way, it's not me screaming at the person going, drink some water, right? Aggressive rehydration is a programmed period of increased consumption. So that's what when we talk about aggressive rehydrating, aggressive refueling, that's what I'm talking about. It's a set period of higher than normal intake. We aggressively rehydrate for a period of time. Let's say it could be half a liter, for example, or 600 mils. And then we ad libitum. And then within 10 to 15 minutes of their next event, we might say 200 or 250. Yeah. But that would be a variable or an optional depending on what their ad libitum consumption's been. Okay. And you would give the person those figures. You would say, if ad libitum's been less than, consume this. If it's been more than, you should be fine.
So just create some variables for it. Hello, Willis.
So these are things to consider. And then going back to the conversation of electrolytes on this topic, the one thing I'm going to be super clear with is the question may be, why have I asked you to halve the dosage of the electrolyte or double the water? It's because when you take in too much sodium or too much electrolytes in general, again, going back to the gastric clearing, but also you can end up with a hyperdose in the joints. And if anyone who's ever over electrolyted themselves before, they know what I'm talking about. You get really stiff in the joints, your fingers become really rigid, your elbows, you might get an exacerbated feeling of parched in the sides of the mouth. So really taking in a nice controlled intake. You may even go 2 bottles, for example, and you do what's called a compound bottle or a combination bottle, and then a fluid bottle, which is just water. And you can go like for like, so 1 for 1. That's another good way to do it as well. But personally, I like to really low dose myself and then just have it as consistent.
Yeah, and that I'm sure that the joint thing you just mentioned is actually probably more common than what I initially, realized as well. Like now looking back on the times which people talk about using electrolytes to try and drink more water. I don't like drinking water.
Yeah.
I'm going to drink electrolytes. And so they're consuming multiple sachets a day of these
Yeah.
high dose sodium electrolytes. And then, talk about joint aches, or they're having like different issues just based on that. So, something to keep into consideration: to flavor your water doesn't mean that you have to use the entirety of it, right?
No,
And
you
there's
don't.
obviously, just taking into consideration the type of, the dose of sodium in the electrolytes you're drinking, if it is for that case. Or, I mean, there's flavor drops and there's other things that you can use to flavor water
Yeah.
that don't have sodium.
Also, as well, go back to
that.
the thing we talked about at the very start, right? Two birds, one stone. Utilizing a low sodium concentrated electrolyte that has a carbonate, staminade, was what we talked about the very, very first few minutes of this conversation. So that's a great example. We're looking at refueling the person from lost glycogen stores. And we want to get a little bit of sodium to boost retention, but not so much that we load the body. And it's an unfortunate thing to admit because I do this for a living, but I've oversodiumed myself. I oversodiumed myself at 2023 Jiu-Jitsu Nationals. And I felt like I couldn't bend my knees properly. And it was horrific. And I went in, it was a random sort of story because it was in spring, but all the days were sort of 19, 20 degrees. And we had this one random day of 33. So I went a little bit hard on the sodiums and I was a giant ball of stiff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess if we're going to once again put this in a neatly wrapped bow and send the people off with I guess a few tools to take into consideration, I'd say obviously we touched on the pre-workout or pre-training hydration. If you're training early in the morning and you're trying to kill two birds with one stone and look at designing a solution of carbohydrates, electrolytes, and fluid before the session to make things a little bit more convenient for you, ensuring you're hitting that hydration goal and adequately fueling the session. Yeah. The rule of 150%.
Yep.
Post, obviously the weight, if you wanted to weigh yourself before and after. And like I said, if you want more information on the, that protocol of the weighing yourself before and after and taking, urine and fluid consumption into consideration, check out the calculator on the Grit Performance website, and that will help do all of the hard work for you, and give you a good idea of what the rehydration numbers that you should be targeting are. Obviously, we just touched on the variables for a competition day in comparison to just a normal training day. But I guess if there's anything else that you want to sort of give the people before we send them off on this last little.
Just understand the things that hydration can affect. And you may think, obviously, this topic today was on hydration, but also understand that it's on hydration for a purpose, because hydration doesn't just affect, how fatigued you feel, but it affects our things like our cognition, for example. And CrossFit is full of strategy in a large part. How you address or how you approach an exercise or a workout matters. Skill set, for example, there are entirely skill-based movements. Well, one of the things you and I were talking about off air before we started this conversation was there's a common figure that people put out there of 2% dehydration affects performance, increases fatigue. Well, at 1%, your cognition starts to decline. So having that conversation with yourself and really assessing your sweat rate and using the scales in the gym and then utilizing the Grit Performance calculator will be a tool that will pay for itself tenfold.
Yeah.
So get yourself a set of scales, or bring your your bathroom scales to the gym, weigh yourself, perform the session, weigh yourself again, go to the Grit website, use that calculator. And then from there, start to really think about that 150% and how you feel when you actually do apply those.
That was a huge takeaway from a lot of people from your talk when we did our Down Under training camp, was the cognitive side of things. Because, we and I related that a lot to obviously skill execution when it comes to CrossFit, decision making from strategy, pacing, and just even movements, right? Like, did you step slightly short before you drop the dead ball, or was it something where you just made these little mistakes from a dehydration perspective? But there's so many people there that still have jobs and they have high functioning jobs, right? And they listen to this and they're there because they cared about CrossFit and performance, but then they were like, man, I'd never even thought of it in that way, that the effect that it has on cognitive ability too. So that was a huge takeaway. So, even though we obviously spoke a lot today about, performance from the physical side of things, just the day-to-day life of you trying to be the best person that you can possibly be and be, cognitively switched on.
It just needs to think about, for example, the cognition aspect. Cognition is an umbrella term, but we're talking about decision-making, as you just stated, putting the foot an inch to the left when you practice inch to the right, or whatever the case may be. Things like mood shift is a big factor too. There's a thing called PVT, or psychomotor vigilance testing, and it's reaction time. So how you respond to a certain instance when you're driving the car, for example, if a person swerves in front of you, all of these things, even things like irritability, and how you respond to the people around you. This can all be affected by dehydration. So if we take that same principle and apply it to everyday life, I think it's pretty obvious. But if we take that same conversation and apply it to a competition day, and you do step right when you should have stepped left, well, and your irritation or your mood shift occurs, what happens in the next session when you're still fuming internally? The next session, right? Are you being emotional? Is it actual emotion, or is it a subset of being dehydrated?
Well, hopefully you guys found some value in the talk today. If you guys have things that you want us to do a deep dive on, whether that is, we've touched on hydration today, there's certain aspects of that, or any other aspects of, training, nutrition conversations that you want us to do a deep dive, let us know, and we'll be sure to make that a priority for one of the podcast episodes. Otherwise, check out the Grit Performance Calculator on the Grit Performance website for anything that you're doing with your next competition or your next training session. I'm sure you'll find some value in that. We'll see you on the next one.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.